Hello everybody, I'm Colin D. Ellis and welcome to the Culture and Coffee podcast, where every episode I discuss a new topic of workplace culture and provide some insights and some practical things for you to do. Don't forget to like, subscribe and to share with people who you may think would be interested. Okay, let's get on with today's episode. Hello everybody, it's Colin here. Welcome to another episode of the Culture and Coffee podcast. In a rare departure away from my usual fancy coffee, I'm drinking an espresso today. For those of you watching the video, it's an arpeggio. You can just about see that, arpeggio. I covered the history of Nespresso on a much earlier podcast, but it was invented. Well, there was a bit of friction between the two inventors. So the original guy was a guy called Eric Favre, who noticed that, I think this is right, he noticed that there was a long queue outside of a coffee shop in Rome, and he found that they were using this special pump system that made the espresso taste so much richer, right? So Eric Favre then patented it for Nestle, who own Nespresso, if you don't know that. It's not George Clooney who owns it, it's Nestle. So they patented it, but he couldn't really get it to work. It was a bit slow, it was a bit cumbersome. So along came this guy called Jean-Paul Gaillard, and he perfected the machine. And then there was this argument, as there always is, between founders who actually created the Nespresso as it is today. And they fell out in the 90s, and all of those things. I think the biggest challenge for Netflix has always been Nespresso. The biggest challenge for Nespresso has always been sustainability, and they've done a really good job on that. And they became a B Corp. If you know anything about B Corps, it's about sustainability. It's about conscious business. So they're getting there. So yes, today I'm drinking a Nespresso. And on today's podcast, I'm going to talk about the 3 levels of toxic culture. Now, toxic culture is something that until about 3 years ago didn't really appear in the media. And this is because there's been a real attitude shift. Toxic culture has been around ever since I started work and before. And I started work a long time ago. But it was always something that you just had to suck it up. Do you know what I mean? For those of you kind of, maybe 45 and older listening to this podcast, the workplaces that we grew up in, it was actually some of the behaviour. It was normal. It was wrong. Don't get me wrong. It's normal. I'm not condoning it in any way, shape, or form, but it was kind of normal for people to verbally abuse other people. There was no concept of psychological safety. Sure, there was physical safety, definitely. Psychological safety, definitely not. There was lots of swearing all of the time. But it really depends on your workplace. You might be listening to this going, well, you know what, I've never witnessed that. And that's great. Because it meant that you were able to learn your craft in an environment that trusted you and helped you and supported you. Around about just kind of post-COVID, and I've been writing about toxic culture for a while, but the media weren't really interested. And that's not to say that they didn't call out some of the really big issues. They definitely did. But now, and again, this is a real change in attitude. It's a real change in generational concern. The media are bringing to the fore toxic culture stories. And they are elevating the role of the whistleblower, which is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. If someone asked me that not so long ago, oh, what's your view on whistleblowers? I'm like, well, if they don't feel that they're able to raise it safely internally and the health and well-being of humans is at stake, then why not? Why? It's incumbent upon organisations to make it safe to raise concerns and then to actually do something about it. I'll share 1 or 2 case studies on today's podcast about that. So it's now become, it is the single biggest risk. So toxic culture is the single biggest risk to organizational health. And I mean that from a financial perspective. I mean it from an attraction perspective, a retention perspective. It really is. It's the single biggest risk. And so my new book, Detox Your Culture, is I kind of use about 40 case studies to really help to identify the issues that others have faced in order that people can avoid them. You know, it's not just a litany of stories. There are plenty of stories in there, plenty of case studies in there. But as ever with the books that I write, you know, there's a real emphasis on the practical. Here's what you can do to avoid this, because, you know, I don't want anyone at all to have a toxic culture. That would be great. Although obviously I want millions of people to buy the book, obviously, if only for, you know, risk management practice. But I think the thing is often, and the subject of today's podcast, is I often, when I read the allegations that have been made and the responses of organizations, and then when I read the reviews, and I've read a lot of reviews into organizational health or the lack thereof, it always seems to be a bit of a surprise. They're like, oh, we didn't know there was a toxic culture. How can we find out? You know, almost like, you know, kind of those monkeys, hear no evil, see no evil, say no evil. It's just like, oh, we didn't know. That's not good enough. It's not good enough in 2023. Now, there are 3 levels of toxic culture. And actually where it starts, where toxic culture starts, isn't actually that toxic. It's just not great. So for those of you who read my book, Culture Fix in 2019, just a quick recap, which I also talk about in Detox Your Culture. There's 2 elements that make up your daily workplace culture. That's the emotional intelligence of individuals, you know, kind of how authentic do people think that you know, to believe that they can be. You know, they understand themselves, they're able to moderate their behaviors, all of those kinds of things, and how engaged they are. How much they care about their work, how much they care about the team, how much they care about what the organization's trying to do, what kind of attitude do they have. And the sweet spot is when high engagement, high emotional intelligence, you've got a vibrant culture. Now, the first level of toxic culture exists when there's high engagement but low emotional intelligence. And that's what we call a combatant culture. Everything's a fight, everything's a battle, everything. And so combatant cultures are where we recognize the importance of the work, we just go about it in the wrong way. Now, I've said before on the podcast, I've said in my speeches, is that every team from time to time may need a metaphorical, not physical, a metaphorical kick up the pants. Right? And so you might see from time to time a little bit of a combatant culture. And that's okay in small doses. You know those days when you've got a bit of a reminder? I know as an employee myself for 30 years, definitely had a reminder. Someone, you know, told me to wind my head in, told me that it wasn't good enough, or whatever, right? Everybody needs that little reminder every now and again. And it's a little bit of a telling off. And you just need a little bit of that when people aren't performing or aren't behaving. For me, it was performance. It wasn't a behavioural issue. It was performance where I hadn't done something. You know, usually I got distracted and worked on the thing that I wanted to work on rather than the thing that needed to get done. And so you felt that tension. There's a little bit of stress. There's a little bit of anxiety. Like, ooh, I've just been told off. So every organisation, every culture needs a little bit of that. But then what you want to do is move straight on and out of that. I remember getting told by a boss once, got told off by him. He read me the riot act, properly read me the riot act. And then he said, all right. He said, we're done. He's like, I've made my point. He said, I don't expect that again. Now let's move forward. And that was great. And that was back to vibrant. I apologized. I was like, okay, let's move on. And we did. We moved on and the culture went back to vibrant and it was great, you know, and I learned from that. And these are those learning moments. When you stay in that combatant quadrant, that's when things start to turn bad. So I call it consistently combatant. When your culture is consistently combatant, that's when it really starts to affect the physical and mental health of employees. Not to a real serious degree, but enough that, you know, you should be worried. So a consistently combatant culture. So what are the signs of that? So high stress anxiety most of the time. Long hours are expected, unclear priorities, or a lack of real clear expectations, passive aggressive communication, lots of emails getting fired with 1 million people copied in and blind copying people in, like microaggressions. Not macroaggressions where the whole team is getting bullied, but just some little microaggressions. And sometimes I always find in a consistently combatant culture with those microaggressions, they're quite often followed by an apology the next day, but nothing really changes. Do you know what I mean? I'm sorry I had to say that in the way that I said it. However, and then they're kind of unapologetic about the fact that, microaggression was their thing the day before. I think as well, consistently combatant culture is where you're just expected to perform. There's no acknowledgement of the work that you do. There's no acknowledgement of the hours that you've put in. There's lots of rumours, lots of gossip, lots of hearsay. There's a lot of profanity. So there's lots of swearing, and it's aggressive. This isn't good enough, and it's not often directed at people, but it could be construed as being directed at people. So these consistently combatant cultures, that's the first sign that things aren't right. And this is where we need to involve HR in these processes. We need to make sure, although HR they don't have a great track record of dealing with this stuff, to be perfectly honest with you. I've got an interview on that with newspaper tomorrow, so that should be fun. They don't have a great track record. However, you still got to follow due process, right? So we still got to involve them. We still got to let them know what we've witnessed. Too often what we do is we're like, oh, well, that's work. No, it isn't. If any of those things that I just described, you're saying that's not work. But at this point, we've got a real opportunity to change. Now, the best way, of course, to deal with this is to first figure out where you're at right now. And so we developed the 5 cultures quiz to help people understand what kind of culture that they have right now. So if you haven't taken the quiz yet, go and undo it, www.5culturesquiz.com. And that will give you an insight not only in the kind of culture you have right now, but the actions you can take. So, I've produced the report, so it's got a list of here's some things you can do to change it. Because at consistently combatant, it's relatively straightforward. Usually it means speaking to an individual. Often it means performance managing an individual, to sort of say, you can't say this, you can't do that. We need to be better on our priorities. We need to be more consistent in the way that we set expectations. So it's easier to deal with if it's dealt with at this level, because it's consistently combatant. It's not yet toxic. But the next level, right? So I always say that's level 0. It's kind of ground 0, consistently combatant, not great. Lots of cultures see this, but at this point, it's relatively straightforward to change it. Because at level 1, we have a proper problem. And at level 1, the media are interested, right? Because these cultures are corrosive. Right, so it's a corrosive. When we talk about that toxicity, it's corrosive. So it's corrosive to people, it's corrosive to results, and it's corrosive to reputation. That's what I mean about the media are getting interested. You may see your good people are starting to leave, and that's definitely your good people will stick around in a consistently combatant culture, but only for a period of time. As soon as it crosses the line into corrosive, that's it, they're done. And they'll find somewhere else, and you're left with the people who don't have the behaviour, or they don't have the energy to change it. They're just sticking around because they can't get what they get elsewhere, so they just stick around, but they're not interested in the change. A corrosive culture, people are off sick. So all of a sudden we've started to see some sick leave, and people are saying it's because of anxiety and it's because of stress. And it's usually more than one person. In a corrosive culture, it's more than one person. All right. So I think at this stage, the media are interested. They'll be collecting information. There'll be calls out to people. What have you heard? What have you heard? What have you heard? So what do we see in a corrosive culture? So this is where we see bullying. This is where we see harassment. So we're starting to get quite serious now. This is where we get shouting, like verbal abuse. Often we get favoritism, so people are given preferential treatment. Yes, that's a sign of corrosive culture, is when we treat one group of people differently than we treat another group. We have unethical behaviour. we have racism, homophobia, and what we're seeing now is different groups of people being treated in completely different ways. Or else what we've got is people just doing things for the, for the good of them. Managers clambering over the top of other people, playing politics, and kind of really making it bad for everyone else. And they'll be going around the back of people, blaming people, finger pointing. Yeah, and it malicious. Your ideas are dismissed. There's no sense of inclusion. So at this level, corrosive cultures, it's becoming more difficult to change. You've still got the opportunity, right, before it really, really, really turns bad. Your engagement score, so consistently combatant engagement score is anywhere between kind of 25 and 40%, something along those lines. Like it's stagnant, but people still care, but not really. A corrosive, you're 25%. The worst score I've ever seen was 21%. And unfortunately, the CEO was the problem in that particular instance, and nothing was going to happen. So I didn't put myself forward for the work, needless to say, because they were interested in just a little bit of window dressing. And so corrosive, this is where we're starting to see. Now, there's been a case in the media in the UK, and at the minute there are allegations. I want to make that clear. There are allegations. There's a show called Strictly Come Dancing. It's a reality show, and the allegations are from one of the contestants to say that she was mistreated. Now, she raised her concerns at the time. So at that time, it was combatant. Right, and then it happened a few times, so it was consistently combatant, and she raised her objections to the treatment, and then left. And when she left, it was corrosive. Right, she had been harassed, physical harm, and she's since received lots and lots of negative social media interaction. So she's been bullied or death threats on social media. She was a contestant on a TV show. So at this point now, it's massively toxic, and the people that commission the show, BBC, are rightly in the news, right? And they're undergoing some kind of investigation at the minute, and hopefully they do that in an independent way. And yet, had they addressed the concerns at the start, so kind of September last year, 2023, they wouldn't be in this position now. They would not be in this position right now, but they left it, and they left it, and they left it, and they left it, to the point where it's toxic now, and it's in the media, and people like me are being asked to quote on it, right? Which is not, it's not somewhere that any organisation ever wants to be, is have the media talk about the toxic culture. But corrosive, right, is really bad. But there's still a possibility of some change. Usually we cut out, not literally, we cut out the individual, we actually get rid of them. Right, we put them on a performance management pathway. If it's a group of individuals, it's the same. There's an internal investigation. At corrosive, it's still possible to kind of mop up the toxic spill. That's level one. At level two, that the culture becomes harmful, and then you've got a minimum of a 2-year journey to turn this around, and you have to lose all of the people that were complicit in it. So the UK Post Office is a great story. Country Road Group in Australia at the minute actually doesn't have a great reputation from a culture perspective, and there's been some allegations there that are being investigated. But at level two, you've got physical assault, you've got emotional cruelty, you've got real angry verbal abuse, you've got threats to people. There's fraud, widespread fraud, and everyone's complicit. Well, senior people are complicit in it. There is overt racism, sexism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, all of those things. There are just outright dismissal of people's concerns when they raise them. No, that's not true. No, he's not that kind of person. No, he would never do that. No, not at all. No. Self-preservation kicks in here now, particularly for senior leaders. And senior leaders have a crucial role to play in not only ensuring that there's deliberate definition of culture to make sure that a psychologically safe culture exists in the first place, but also for making sure that when it's noted that the culture is consistently combatant, that something is done about it. And of course, by the time it gets to a harmful level 2 harmful culture, the senior leadership team really need to go. You know, the UK Post Office is the biggest story on toxic culture for the last couple of years. And some of the people that oversaw that culture are still employed by the Post Office. And, you know, there's just no opportunity for cultural trauma, because that's what it is, you know, to be dealt with while those people are still on board. So it's a real issue. So as you can see, toxic culture doesn't happen by chance. There are signs all the way through. Consistently combatant is where, you know, it's really, you can see the signs there. Sometimes we pretend they're not there, or we make excuses, like I said, oh, that's who they are. You'll get used to him. That's the way he communicates. Is worse when it's the person at the very top. You know, and I've coached 1 or 2 senior leaders, to be fair, and they're like, all right, I didn't realize that was the problem until I was told. And that's often hard for people to tell senior leaders, but culture is everybody's responsibility. So it's important that we do. But culture is not a black box anymore that you only see when the thing crashes. Culture is visible, all of this clear perspex box. And so leaders within organizations, and this goes from the board of directors to the executive, to the senior leadership team, to the management team, however you're structured, everybody has got a responsibility to make sure the culture doesn't become toxic. Everybody has got responsibility. Now, this requires organizations educate their managers. You know, I was with a client today talking about the modern management program that we're running to make sure that we educate managers on how to build, maintain, and maintain vibrant cultures, but avoid toxic cultures. Because, you know, every organization wants to achieve its results, wants to achieve its targets, and the way that you do that is through a vibrant culture. Toxic culture not only undermines the targets that you're looking to achieve, but it fundamentally ruins the lives of people. So they are your 3 levels of toxic culture. Like I said, the best way to deal with your culture is to find out where you are right now. So don't forget to head on over and take the quiz at www.5culturesquiz.com. And if you're in the UK, you can pre-order my new book, Detox Your Culture, which is released on the 29th of August. Actually, if you're in any country, you can pre-order my book. It just might take a while to get there, and the postage might just take a little bit long, cost a little bit more. But you know what? It's worth it to avoid a toxic culture. All right, that's it for your podcast today. Hope you enjoyed it. Ciao for now. Thanks for listening to today's podcast. If you'd like to find out more about how I can help you transform the culture of your team, head to my website at www.colindellis.com.